All right, so we'll get our last panel going, and as I foreshadowed this morning, I think this is going to be a really fun one.
Okay.
So let me turn this over to Hugh Courtney.
I'm going to be looking this way.
Will introduce his panel.
He waves at me, starts to jump up and down.
Thank you, Earl. Good afternoon. Again, I'm Hugh Courtney. I'm Dean of the McKim School of Business here at Northeastern University. It's my great honor and pleasure to moderate our panel this session on building a technology cluster, lessons learned. I have four distinguished panelists joining me here today, and they are first David Goodtree, co-chair of the Massachusetts Water Innovation Mission to Israel and co-organizer of SWIM. David is a frequent speaker on the innovation economy and about water technology, including recent events at TEDx Boston, E2 Environmental Entrepreneurs, and the MIT Enterprise Forum. Previously, David was VP of Marketing with Akamai Technologies and Group Director of Forrester Research. David is an active angel investor and board advisor in technology, and I know well known by just about everybody in this room. At the end, I have Chris McIntyre. Chris is Senior Vice President and President of Xylem Analytics Value Center. Chris held the same position at ITT, which he joined in March 2010 with the acquisition of Nova Analytics. And most recently, Chris has been given the additional responsibilities for leading Xylem's corporate sustainability initiatives. Prior to joining ITT, Chris held several leadership roles at Nova Analytics and Thermo Fisher Scientific. And importantly, at least to me, and I hope to Chris, is that he earned his MBA here at Northeastern. We also have Representative Carolyn Dykema, who was elected to the Massachusetts House of Representatives in the fall of 2008, represents the 8th Middlesex District of the Metro West region. Representative Dykema has been working to address water concerns both professionally and a public service capacity since 1999. For example, she worked in business development for an environmental consulting and engineering firm, where she helped public and private sector clients with water management solutions, including low-impact development, site design, and remediation of groundwater contamination. As a legislator, Representative Dykema has continued to pursue initiatives related to water, resource protection, and sustainability as a member of the Committee of the Environment, Natural Resources, and Agriculture. And last but not least, we have Jonathan Kaladu, who leads 11th Avenue Strategies, a consultancy specializing in water, environmental, and conservation issues. Within his consultancy, Jonathan acts as a U.S. representative for the Stockholm International Water Institute and as the coordinator of the Growing Blue Water Economics Collaborative. And during his career, Jonathan has worked with the U.S. EPA, Massachusetts EOEA General Counsel, New York Regional Counsel for the Nature Conservancy, and held other council and management positions as well. So it's obvious we have a particularly strong panel here today to discuss lessons learned on building technology cluster. In particular, since David, Chris, and Carolyn recently participated in the mission to study the Israeli water cluster. How many in the room were actually part of that mission? There's a lot of you here. So good friends with our panelists here. And at the same time, Jonathan has been studying a broader range of water cluster initiatives in other parts of the U.S. and world. And we hope by comparing and contrasting these experiences relative to the Massachusetts experience, we hope to draw out concrete lessons for accelerating the development of Massachusetts' emerging water industry cluster. Now, one thing we know about all successful economic clusters is that they require a set of organizations from the business, academic, government, and social sectors with complementary skills and interests to work together to create the conditions for takeoff. And when we look at some of the most well-known and successful water industry clusters, such as in Israel and Singapore, it may be easier to understand why these different organizations are able to align their interests. After all, in these countries with limited access to ample clean water supplies, water supply innovation is a national security imperative. And so as we consider other clusters today, one thing I want all of us to be asking our panelists and to ourselves today is, what does it take to fully align interests across business, academic, government, and social sector organizations to help build a water cluster right here in Massachusetts, where, quite frankly, we're blessed with a relatively abundant supply of clean water. Now, we're going to start our exploration first by focusing on the Israeli cluster, and David Goodtree is going to launch us on that. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Switch it for you.
You, go. Slideshow. Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. So this is the delegation, 48 people, the Massachusetts Water Innovation Mission to Israel in December. Some of you see your faces, so I'm actually not going to tell you anything new, but this is for the benefit of the rest of you, and you saw lots of hands raised before, so talk to those people as well. It was in December 2002. Here we're standing for the group photo in front of ancient Roman water aqueducts in Caesarea, which was the port of Rome to the Middle East. 2,000-year-old water innovation. But I'm going to tell you a little bit more about why we went there. It wasn't to stand in this beautiful place, but why we went there and what we went to learn and what we came home with. A little context. The modern state of Israel was founded in 1948. At the time, it was an arid land, which still is an arid land, of sand and swamp. Many people lived in tents, no water infrastructure, no treatment, no transport of water, no wastewater treatment by and large anywhere. At that same time, here in Massachusetts, we already had a decades-old water infrastructure in Boston. We had reservoirs, we had treatment. You know, they're digging ditches. This is today. Major cities like Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Haifa, clean beaches, treated water, treated wastewater, high rises, urban runoff, storm water. Looks like it could, in fact, in America. And if you look at an interesting picture from outer space of the entire Middle East, now this is just Israel and a little bit of Jordan and Syria and Lebanon, but if you look at a picture of Israel from outer space, it's the color of sand, except in the past few years, Israel is green. It is the only place in the Middle East that looks like this. Israel is between the Mediterranean, salty, on the west, and those two little let's call them lakes, the Sea of Galilee where Jesus walked and the Dead Sea. Those are their only lakes, one dead, one dying. How did they do this? Israel today reuses 75% of its water. That's the #1 country in the world for water reuse. It tops Spain at 17% and the United States at less than 1%. It's considered the global desalination innovation leader. They operate the world's first and second largest operating saltwater reverse osmosis plants. An Israeli company was named the Desal Company of the Year by Global Water Intelligence. They have the lowest cost operating expense of any desal plant worldwide, and 85% of their domestic supply of water will come from desal this year. 3 of the world's 4 largest drip irrigation companies are Israeli. They have the highest global efficiency of crop yield to water use. In fact, they export carrots to Russia, just about the cheapest commodity to a country that has the largest freshwater lake in the world. And yet it's cheaper and more efficient to do it in Israel and ship it to Russia. 90% of households use solar to heat water, and they have one of the world's largest industry conferences, WATEC. Okay, so in this context of the arid country with nothing becoming the global innovation leader and satisfying its needs, the biggest takeaway of our trip was seeing really what could be accomplished when industry, government, academia, and finance work together, which they do. The Israelis turned around their water situation and developed an industry that is both satisfies their needs and an economic driver for global expansion. They have much fewer resources than we have, yet they put themselves on the map. Our objectives for the trip were 3. 1, develop partnerships in business, academia, and government. So being a cluster, we want things to originate here, but we also want to be a magnet for innovation, partnership, and opportunity from other places. So this is about forming those partnerships. Second, learn from Israel's success developing its water cluster, which is very much like ours in the sense of it's messy and innovative and distributed as compared to a Singaporean model, which is very top-down. and attract Israeli businesses to Massachusetts as they become ready for global expansion. They have a small home market, no regional market to speak of because they are surrounded by Syria and Egypt, so they need access to the North American market. We want to be their home away from home, which is a phrase you heard the governor use this morning. There were 48 participants from every part of our industry cluster. You can see some of their logos there. I want to particularly recognize the co-chairs of the trip, Earl Jones, Jim Matheson, Pete Tunnicliffe, Tom Burton, who's in the room from Mintz Levin, and me, and special mention to Jonathan Shapiro, who did a lot of the heavy lifting about putting together the connections that we needed. Some of the things that we did were visit the largest desalination plant in the world in Hadera, which has the lowest cost operating expense. We talked with the Minister of Energy and Water, who talked about their long-term plan that they're now almost completely fully realized to make themselves fully self-sufficient and begin to restore the health of the dying Sea of Galilee, which is less dying than it was because they're pulling less water out of the natural environment. They also talked about how they are designing their ability to produce water through desal and recycling and other means so that they could satisfy their own needs and become, in 2014, a net water exporter. And furthermore, use water as a tool to negotiate peace. No other country in the world that I've been able to find has turned around their situation from where they were to net water exporter. We also visited 8 digesters under construction at the Shafdan wastewater treatment plant, which was designed by CDM Smith of Massachusetts, a massive installation, and a UN-designated model filtration plant. Finally, one of the pieces of the agenda, which was 4 days, 12 hours a day, 48 hours of agenda packed in, and then drinking after 10 p.m. Only those people who went laughed, good. Was we organized the Wet Revolution competition. So kind of like our little competition today, our objective was to attract Israeli technology companies to interact with our delegation. The subtitle of that event was Advancing Water Export Technology from Israel to the Global Market. That's what they want, that's what we want. 32 companies applied, 6 finalists got to present. An august panel of judges, many of whom were in the room, made a decision and a selection. The guy in the middle with the red tie represents the winner. He's the CEO of a company called TA Count, and as part of the winning for that, all the 6 finalists got things, but the winner got a free boarding pass and trip to Massachusetts, and he's here today. TA Count, Charles, are you in the room? Missed his opportunity. So they do real-time detection of biotoxins. To wrap up, it was clear that while Israel is a small home market, and like other water innovative economies in Singapore, Germany, and Netherlands, foreign companies need help accessing the Americas and the global market. Here are a handful of examples of companies with Israeli roots that found success by connecting with companies here in Massachusetts, which in turn has grown our economy and the companies within it. Desalitech is an Israeli company which attracted venture capital from Liberation Capital and its Massachusetts partner, Earl Jones. After investigating locations in California, Florida, and South Carolina, Desalitech chose Massachusetts to establish its U.S. headquarters. Poseidon Water here in Boston is providing almost $1 billion in project finance for the largest desalination project in the Western Hemisphere in Carlsbad, California, with that project being designed by IDE of Israel. The sensor-activated faucet was designed by Natan Parsons, an Israeli at MIT, which was acquired, and the marketing rights were acquired, and ultimately the company was acquired by Sloan Valve of Massachusetts, which now operates in our state. The membrane brine concentrator technology behind Oasis Water of Boston was invented by Menachem Elimelech, an Israeli professor at Yale. Coke Membrane Systems acquired nanofiltration technology now branded as CellRO from Israeli company Membrane Products. And Energy Points, founded by 2 Israelis in Massachusetts, provide analytics around energy and water to help large enterprises make smart decisions about resource utilization. So touching on our last trip objective, it became clear that Massachusetts can be the home away from home for growing companies from Israel and other markets. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thanks for setting the context for the Israeli trip. Chris and Carolyn will now focus on other lessons learned from that trip. Chris, can we start with you?
Yeah, great. David, that's a nice job, so I very much appreciate that. Before I start and talk about some of the lessons learned, I think it's important that there is sort of a fourth objective or outcome of the trip. And so, those were pretty clear, and I think we understand them. But for those of you that have been with us today, you've probably heard about this trip over and over again. People get introduced, and we were all together on the trip. And it feels like we all created a bit of a sub-network here for the start of the cluster, where the 48 of us that went, it was only 4 days, but I think it was probably 10 working days, right? I mean, they were long days, and we had a full agenda, and we spent a lot of bus time, which meant we all got to know each other pretty well. And so it's great to see everybody, but I think it serves as a real good starting point for this network to keep things going. And so when our day jobs and when things pull us in other directions, all of us don't return calls every single day, right? All of us have things that we have to prioritize. But when the folks that I went to this trip with to Israel call me or email me, I answer them, and they answer me. And I think that's really important. And I think that's an objective that was probably baked into the original thinking of the trip. And I think it's a real important takeaway. And I think it gives us a real good head start to make something of this, to make it work. And I think it's important that we recognize it. Okay, so let's just talk about, you got to hear Gretchen today, which was great. And for me, to be able to continue focusing on water instrumentation and to do it in a company whose tagline is "Let's Solve Water" is pretty cool. It couldn't have worked out better. So I wasn't going to use my slide, but I see it's up. I put it up only because this is from our website. I mean, I didn't make this up for today. This is there, and this has been our tagline and our vision. And I'll simply read it. We devote our technology, time, and talent to advance the smarter use of water. That resonates with the room pretty well. And we look to a future where global water issues don't exist, a pretty big statement. And I think it means a lot to the folks in the room. And I hope you can now all agree. I would not have put this up because it could sound corny and a bit corporate had you not heard the conviction in Gretchen's voice this morning, right? She's the real deal. She means it. She is serious about this. And so I think it's important that you understand that Xylem being here is completely connected with the mission of the company. And to be here in Massachusetts and continuing the work that we started here 10 years ago, and to be part of a public company that's headquartered in New York but allowed to continue to work on this and support it is really fantastic. So I want to talk about a couple of takeaways. So, we learned about Israel. We didn't just learn about water. We learned about the history and the culture, and it was important because it helped us learn the nexus of need and the passion that was required to create the pictures that David showed. There was a real burning desire and need, a national need, to solve water issues. And the culture of the folks in Israel and the tenacity and the passion came together to solve problems. And we got to see that in 4 days in a pretty good light. We got to understand how people think and how they do things. We saw how different parties, academia, government, industry, startups, came together collaboratively to solve these problems. And we saw it, and they didn't seem to be barriers. They all seemed to be together working and solving these problems. And again, for me, with a company with a tagline, "Let's Solve Water," it just seemed that's what they were doing in each and every place we went. So it resonated pretty strongly with me. We saw a clear parallel, for me anyway, in that here in the Commonwealth, we have a desire to harness what we have in terms of capital and talent and everything that makes this Commonwealth great. And while we don't have the national issue of security and we don't have a state or a nation to build, we're going to create that passion here to harness our resources to get at water, to get at the cluster, and to, quite frankly, solve the world's water problems, right? It's not about what happens here. It's about local actions that can impact the world and quite simply help the world not have water issues. So I think it was great to see it live, to see it working, to see it happening. And I think here in the Commonwealth, we have an opportunity to learn with what they've done in Israel and with the passion here to follow in the footsteps of what they've done around water.
Thank you very much, Chris. Carolyn?
Thank you, and it's really great to be here. I also want to just recognize, and David, I know he's been recognized earlier, but he really has played such a pivotal role in bringing all this together. It really can't be overstated. Listening to Chris's comments about the power of this trip that we took to Israel, really what this was for me was living the true power of this cluster that we'd sort of been talking about conceptually, but I think what we were able to achieve in those 4 days, and Chris had mentioned sort of the free flow of information that is continuing among those participants in that trip, just walking into this room and having that immediate connection with people that you spend so much social time with. I mean, the power of that in being able to create synergies among all these stakeholder groups that we've been talking about bringing together, I think is hard to quantify, but is so important. So it's great to be able to expand that sort of initial family we created to this room and hopefully even beyond. What I guess I'd like to bring to this conversation is the public sector perspective. And going into this Israel trip, we had talked about this cluster, and my initial question going in was, I think there's really opportunity here around innovation. The state should have a stake in this, but what does that look like? What does it mean to say that the government needs to play a role, and how does that translate into action? So going on this trip to me was a way to kind of kick the tires and see how it works and talk to the relevant people to see how we could bring some of these learning back to Massachusetts. And it did all that and more. What struck me, I guess, initially was the great differences from a political standpoint of water and the water issue and its relationship to the public in Israel versus here in Massachusetts. And Chris had mentioned the passion of the Israeli people, and really driven by the need for sovereignty, some of the national security issues over there, which we really don't have here. And so I think one challenge that we have that Israel doesn't is the fact that we're trying to wake the public up to the need to be more passionate about water, the need to invest more in water, especially here in Massachusetts, where we've really got an abundance of water. It's really, it takes some conversation. It takes a lot of educating people to make them realize what the potential here is. So that was really one of the bigger differences, but clearly the overwhelming message was the need for this close coordination. So as I went through the trip, I sort of tried to identify what were the action items I could bring home. And I did, when we came home, we continued these conversations, and I filed several pieces of legislation that at least begin the conversation about how we can move some of these ideas forward and how the state can play a more formal role. And I guess I've divided them into 4 categories of issues that I think, where we can really add value as a public sector. One of them is convening this group and similar groups. I think that the government, Secretary Sullivan, clearly the governor has played a strong role there already. We need to continue to raise the visibility of this issue and bring people to the table. That's probably the easier of any of the 4. The second one is the funding piece. Clearly providing funding around this industry is key, probably one of the more challenging aspects from a public sector perspective, especially in this economy. But we need to be looking at this as an economic opportunity, and the money that we invest now really will drive expansion in the future. And providing incentives. One of the bills that I filed provides more investment in local infrastructure, in our municipal infrastructure that our towns are very passionate about. I know Fred Lasky at MWRA constantly hears from his communities about the need, how important these water infrastructure projects are, and the need to maintain rates at a reasonable level. How can we use the state funding that we are providing to create incentives for municipalities to be more receptive and to choose the innovative solution as opposed to maybe some of the more traditional solutions, so that when we invest this money as a state, we're looking to invest in next generation technology versus expanding last generation technology. Another way that I know I missed the earlier presentation, and I'm sorry for that, but I'm sure the commissioner talked about the regulatory opportunities for us here in Massachusetts to really set up a regulatory structure to be more friendly to innovation and to make sure that we understand what the barriers might be there and address those from a regulatory standpoint. The commissioner has really been a leader on that since we've come home and doing some of that as well. And I'll give you an example of one of those things. The administrative consent order process, or those communities who are looking at a requirement to make an investment in infrastructure for one reason or another, is there an opportunity for us, and I believe there is, to help those communities or give them some relief in exchange for perhaps being a little more open to considering new technologies, which then provides an opportunity for the folks in this room to meet those technological challenges in order to solve real world problems that are existing in our municipalities today. And then lastly, I served on a Water Infrastructure Finance Commission over the last 3 years, which was primarily targeted toward finding out how much we are underinvesting in our municipal infrastructure, water related here in Massachusetts. One of the themes that came up over and over again was the idea of risk, and the idea that municipalities and most anyone looking to purchase water infrastructure, it's such a long-term investment, very, very risk averse. So how can the state play a role perhaps in changing that risk dynamic and taking the risk off of some of those municipalities, off some of those purchasers who might be a little more receptive then to adopting some of this new technology. And one of, I think, the key takeaways out of the Israel trip was when we went to visit Shavdan, which is the wastewater treatment plant. They had the state had recognized the need to sort of promote innovation using public infrastructure and had created a pilot facility right there on site where innovators could bring new ideas for technology, actually have them tested and piloted at this public facility and come away with what I guess I'm calling a public imprimatur or some kind of at least credibility statement from the government that this technology meets a certain standard to make it much easier to commercialize on a broader scale. So I filed legislation again on that project as well, and we've certainly been in a lot of conversation with Fred about whether we can do something like that at MWRA, and there seems to be a lot of real interest on the part of all the stakeholders to moving that forward. So I'm really looking forward to continuing this conversation. I think we have a tremendous opportunity here in Massachusetts. We heard the passionate governor speaking this morning here about all that Massachusetts offers, about our academic talent, about our sort of innovative drive. We have a real opportunity here to create jobs. And while Israel clearly is connected to the national security issue, I think we here in Massachusetts have made it a priority in the legislature and in government to focus on creating jobs here in Massachusetts. There's a lot of public momentum behind that. Here's a great way that we can channel that momentum into a solid initiative here where we can create jobs as well as solving local problems and solving world problems. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. Yes, let's have a round of applause now. Good. Last but not least, we have Jonathan, who's going to expand our vision a bit here and talk more generally about what's going on in water cluster development, both in the U.S. and around the world.
Okay, thank you. It's just a delight for me, everyone, to be here. I'm a born and bred Bostonian, even though I'm now in New York. And half of my 30-year career has been based here in Boston. And I just want to reiterate what Carolyn has said. There's a tremendous opportunity, I think, for Massachusetts in the world of water, so to speak. And it's going to be an opportunity that's only going to grow in importance through the years and the decades to come. I want to talk to you ever so briefly about two things. Okay. Two things right now. The first is the Growing Blue Collaborative, which those of us working within it's a virtual water cluster, okay? And again, I just want to share what's going on with it and invite all of you to participate in it. There are great opportunities to participate in it. And it's looking for participants. I've heard from and talked to many of you last night and today, and there are great opportunities for Massachusetts in terms of getting itself out and known to do so in part through Growing Blue. And of course I say getting yourself known and out because despite the strengths of Massachusetts, and they're really profound strengths, I believe, in terms of building a successful water cluster here, there's a great deal going on around the world in terms of water now. And again, I want to share some of that with you. The second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to be your brief tour guide. I'm going to give you a view internationally at some of the water cluster, water space activity. Pear started it, but I'm going to continue it. It's certainly not going to be inclusive, understand that. And I'll do the same for what's going on here in the US as well. Okay, but so Growing Blue, everyone, I am overseeing the Growing Blue Collaborative, founded about 18 months ago. And it's really, as I say, a virtual water cluster. It's a database. It's an open source, non-proprietary database that's made up of, that's a pretty important public-private partnership. Here are the executive committee participants in the Growing Blue effort. And I say participants, it's not legally organized. I'm trained as a lawyer, as you heard. You know, we're still an unincorporated association. And the thinking is, again, to keep it administratively light. It doesn't necessarily need to have any formal legal structure to it. I know the lawyers in here don't want to hear that, but as a reformed lawyer, I feel it's my right to say that. But so Growing Blue is building a huge resource, a library of material for those of you interested in water issues and those of you decision makers in the water field, whether it's academia, whether it's industry, whether it's government, to use, okay? And you can see we've got a very healthy and good mix of public and private participants in it at the executive committee level, IBM and GE and Xylem and Cardno-Entrix, Columbia's Earth Institute, the CEO Water Mandate is the UN Global Water Compacts. The UN is doing some very interesting stuff on water these days, and its CEO Water Mandate is participating. But we're building this out. This is going to be a long-term, enduring effort that is, again, going to be, we hope, a cluster, so to speak, that provides the rest of you. It's going to be a support cluster for the clusters that are growing. Okay, and we're looking for, we've got a blog going, and important contributors to it, Kathy Shandling from IPCA, Jim Matheson said he'll contribute to the blog, Gretchen, who was with us this morning, is a blog contributor. But again, we're focusing on water and economics, okay, and again, so for a cluster that's really technologically or industrially focused, and the clusters around the world, and even here in the US, they differ in terms of their characteristics. Karen Goldmer and I were having a very interesting talk about that recently. But so the, for those of you who are into the technology and industrial sides of what's going on in water, Growing Blue, we hope, will be a really important tool in the future for those of you to use. We're going to have a Growing Blue event. Hugh or David, I can't remember, mentioned the Global Water Initiative. Global Water Intelligence, which is out of the UK, but they host the American Water Summit, and that's going to be a Growing Blue, I'm sorry? Yeah, it's going to be there's going to be a Growing Blue event there, and it's going to be making the economic case for water. So again, we're really beginning to focus on the economic aspects of water in ways that we didn't in the past. Let me now turn to my tour guide role, okay, for a second. Here we've got a map of the world, and I'm just going to walk you through, some of the activity that's going on around the world in terms of water clusters, water centers. But for Israel, where I haven't been, I've had the profound privilege of visiting all of these places in the past 6 years. First, as I finished up my tenure at the Nature Conservancy, I was building the Nature Conservancy's Global Water Stewardship Program. And that involved putting infrastructure in many of these places of the world, at many of these water centers, okay? And then in my consultancy the past 2 years, I've been doing work with several of them as well. Let me start over in Asia and Oceania, okay? We've heard about Singapore, okay? The Koreans, everyone, the Koreans are going very strong on water, okay? Korea's hosting the next World Water Forum. Have any of you been to any of the World Water Forums? Yeah, the World Water Forums are I describe them as the Olympics of water, okay? They take place every 3 years, hosted by nations. Korea's hosting the next one, okay? France hosted the last one. Turkey hosted the one before that. And these are very, very important water conferences and get-togethers, okay? They sort of taken the place, I mentioned the UN before and its work on water, but the UN doesn't have any formal structure in place for dealing with water. It's spread throughout the UN and its numerous global offices. So the World Water Forum has taken the place of that, but there's a great deal of technology and industry representation at the World Water Forums as well, okay? And the Koreans, like Singapore, they're very top-down, they're very conformist in terms of their work on water, I would say. And I don't use that word conformist in any pejorative sense, but they pull together very much. And again, some of you I've been talking to during my time here and in the past, the characteristics of a culture are very important to building one of these clusters and building it successfully, okay? And so that's something to think about in terms of what's going on with us. Australia, everyone, I was thinking about Pear's slide about what our dear cousins to the north, Ontario, think about what's going on and the importance of it. I've got to say, in my opinion, Ontario is doing good work, but I wouldn't rank it at the top. The Australians are doing a lot of great work on water, okay? The star that I put on Australia is down in Adelaide. Adelaide's got a very, very strong water industry, water technology cluster going, okay? It's now in the $1 billion+ range. And it's Australia, again, in terms of similarities to Israel, similarities to Singapore, its focus on water has come out of necessity. Australia has been hurt economically very badly, first by drought, and now by, terrible deluges over the past couple of years. Let me move now into Europe. I'm going to skip over Israel, which has been talked about. Up in Sweden, where Pear's from, and as you heard, I'm representing the Stockholm International Water Institute, 25 years old, and it's mainly doing water policy work now, again, but Stockholm is unquestionably one of the water centers, water clusters, whatever you want to call it, of the world, okay? And there's plenty of technological prowess in Scandinavia, don't doubt that for a second. The Swedes can swim in Stockholm in the summer, in downtown Stockholm. It's a city of islands, and they've conquered the problems, and the problems were very similar to ours, combined sewer overflows, stormwater, a very old city. But they've conquered it in ways that, frankly, we Americans haven't yet. So the Swedes are very strong on water, okay? Then I've got a star in Belgium. Per spoke about the Germans and the Dutch. The Germans and the Dutch do a lot of their work out of Belgium, okay, in Brussels, where the European Commission is based, and out of the European Water Partnership. They're going very strong, just recently, into water technology and innovation. And again, in terms of funding for all of this, I don't really have time to go into this at all, really, but I'd be glad to talk to any of you about how some of these clusters get funded. The European Commission, we all read the terrible stories about, the European economy, which I think is the case, but the European Commission still has a lot of money, and it's very interested in supporting this sort of work. Down in France, in Marseille, southern France, Marseille is known as the City of Water. It's the home of the World Water Council. And it's interesting, I was talking to someone before lunch, two French companies, Veolia and Suez, and you saw from my Growing Blue slide, Veolia is one of the executive committee members. Veolia and Suez are two of the biggest, if not the biggest, private water companies in the world. Okay, so Veolia used to have, I don't know whether they still do, they had an innovation technology center based in California. But they're all over, and again, I'm throwing these out so you can understand, there are collaborative opportunities. All of these efforts collaborate with each other, one to a certain extent, okay? And of course, the Israel-Massachusetts connection is a very important one and a very good and strong one, it seems to me right off the bat. But these are things to think about. Who else is out there strategically for us to build our cluster with? But so there's a lot going on in Europe, a lot going on. Let me jump now to Latin America, okay? Down in Chile, Chile hosted the first ever Water Week Latin America back in March. The State Department invited me down to be one of the U.S. representatives there. And the Chileans are going very strong in water, okay? They're looking for solutions to their mining issues, to their agricultural issues. Colombia, the same thing. Colombia can't build in its burgeoning cities the infrastructure that we have, so they're looking for all sorts of technological innovations to the problems of treating urban wastewater and supplying water. Then in Mexico, right below us, at the Monterrey Tech, and Monterrey Tech has been described to me as the MIT of Mexico, but it's got the Water Center for Latin America and the Caribbean base there, okay? And it's going very strong, gets a lot of money from the Inter-American Development Bank, okay? So there's some very heavy hitters out there around the world working on water clusters. And of course, I had Ontario up there, and we heard a bit about Ontario, so I'll skip that. You know, here in the U.S., ever so quickly, you know, out on the West Coast, there's a lot going on. Fresno, you know, I hear people out in California saying they want to build the Silicon Valley of water out in California. In Arizona, you know, what we find here in the U.S., what's developing everyone, and this is again something for those of us here in Massachusetts to think about, okay? What we see happening in the U.S. is that the regions of the country that are water stressed is where there's a lot of focus going on, and, okay, obviously. But, you know, Arizona and the Colorado River Basin states are doing a lot of work on water. You know, we've heard about Milwaukee and Milwaukee's Water Council. You know, the city made the conscious decision to establish itself as a global water center and several years ago, and it's going strong. It's getting significant financial support from both the state of Wisconsin and from the city of Milwaukee itself. Okay, Cincinnati's where, and Sally's here from the EPA's office. Cincinnati, you know, the EPA is doing some very good work. And this is just a few of them, everyone. I mean, there's more going on. Texas has a lot going on. Florida has a lot going on. These are states that have serious water problems, okay? Let me stop there, okay, and get back into the panel. But that's a very quick overview, everyone, of what's going on nationally and internationally. And again, I present it to you, you know, in terms of being strategic about the development of, you know, the Massachusetts water cluster. You know, I think collaboration is extremely important in all of this work. And culturally, think about us. I mean, we're individuals, okay? And does that, in certain ways, that's good for us in terms of building, you know, and expanding and being aggressive in terms of building a water cluster here in Massachusetts that's, you know, pushing things technologically and in terms of innovation. In certain ways, it means, you know, it rubs against our sort of inherent, innate character to work with others, okay? So again, collaboration is absolutely critical about this. And then understanding strengths and weaknesses, using, you know, the analytical strengths. We heard the governor talk about, you know, one of the great resources of the Commonwealth, of course, is its brain power, okay, and its educated workforce. I mean, using those, using analytical strengths to decide and figure out, you know, how to move forward with a water cluster is really important. Thanks.
Thank you, Jonathan. Let me check with our timekeepers. Can I ask for one question? I'll defer my own, and let's have one lucky questioner right here. Thank you.
Yeah, what's going on in Chile? I'm not sure. Is that Vina Del Mar?
Yeah, Vina Del Mar, exactly. And it's coming out of Santiago to a certain extent. The Fundación Chile and the Chilean government, you know, Vina Del Mar, have decided to go very heavy into water issues. And you know, this is again one of the cultural things that's so fascinating about what's going on in the water world. I mean, the Chilean government has decided to look very seriously about reorganizing its entire approach to governing water, okay? And it's pulling in industry to help it do that, okay? And this is some of the synergism that Carolyn was talking about between government and the private industry and academia. You know, it's happening in other places where if you take it gets back to the analytics that I was talking about, using it in a different context, of course, Chris. If you take a good hard look at other places, you can see, you know, what might be successful here.
Thank you. It strikes me that there are a couple of things that we can learn from these various clusters abroad. One point that I thought was quite interesting, that I think Chris really stressed, was the idea that it was the trip itself and the time together that, in an informed context, that raised questions, created relationships, et cetera. And the other, of course, is the specific lessons learned about, you know, how an industry grew and the impact it's had over time. And so, one last question then to the panelist here is that if you thought about moving forward with this cluster, you could take those two lessons and say, how can we, without actually going, you know, abroad and visiting all these clusters, how can we kind of virtually create that sort of learning environment that happened when you did it in Israel, that was a catalyst for really collaboration? And then the second one is, what do you all take? What is a very concrete lesson learned from some of these different environments that you say this is absolutely this aspect of it is at least a blueprint for Massachusetts. And everyone gets one last final word on that. We'll make it quick because then I'll be in trouble if we go too much longer. David?
I think what made the experience special was that we had a shared experience that was an intense experience. And actually, working on the symposium with all the people that were assembled to do that, and I do want to give credit, and I don't know that anybody else is going to do that. Earl Jones deserves enormous credit for being the first one up to say, let's do this symposium again, and then leading the charge and bringing lots of other people in. So,
Way to go, Earl.
So the point is a shared experience. So I feel like I have common interests we found areas of common interest, and everybody's doing different things. We have common interests, and then we did it together. And so everybody who I did this with together, who were all engaged together, and we went to Israel, wow, I'm their friends, and I take their calls, and I respond to their calls. So we're kind of on this shared mission, and that's fun. It's about a personal mission and drive.
I guess, I would just echo what David said. This is, at the end of the day, the cluster is really all about relationships and how do we keep those relationships going. And one of the critical aspects that came out of our debrief session at the end of the trip was, how do we keep this going? And I think events like Swim that bring everyone together are so critical to keeping that flywheel. As Earl says, keeping that flywheel moving. This isn't, this is something you need to nurture and continue to work at. And so I think that's what we all need to make sure to keep happening. And then as far as the takeaway, sort of the pragmatic takeaway from all this, I think this pilot initiative, working with MWRA, this seems like the most tangible, immediate action item that really has some momentum behind it at this point, and really, I'd like to focus on that over the next few months to make it happen.
Terrific. Jonathan?
Well, again, just to reiterate to a certain extent what David and Carolyn have said, I mean, the collaborative aspects of building a cluster, especially, given our cultural characteristics as I was describing them, can't be emphasized enough, okay? And getting out. I know we were hearing earlier today about, getting out, going to places. I think that building the relationships, I think David put it beautifully, and Chris, you're on a bus for 10 hours or you're working for 10 hours for 4 days, but get out to some of the conferences that are going on, and make connections there and let them know what's going on in Massachusetts. Again, there is a fair amount of noise out there, so you've got to make sure that this Massachusetts story, which is a very compelling one, is told and that people understand it.
Chris, final word.
Great. So, first, what can we do? I mean, I think we're doing a lot of the right things, so I think the trip was a good start. This meeting, Swim last year and Swim this year, I attend a lot of these sorts of meetings. I'm sure we all do. What sets this one apart for me is the commitment that you see from the people involved. So it's a pretty broad group of people, and the people are generally a bit more personally committed than you tend to see. You go to some of these conferences, and you get pretty glitzy talks and all, but you don't feel the passion and the connection. And I think continuing to do that is really important. I think it's going to get harder from here. We're at a point now where we have to come together as a group, and we have to come together and do some work, and we have to set some goals. And we will challenge our common thinking on the direction we want to move in, and I think that's fine. I think that's good. I think, to echo, what Carol and I think, targets that are tangible, things that we can all rally around, make sure that we get our points of view across and get heard. I think setting a goal is really important for us to make sure that we can take the relationships that we've built, take this sort of energy, and turn it into something that ultimately we're all proud of.
Well, commitment is the theme, so please join me in honoring the commitment from Chris, Jonathan, Carolyn, and David today for a terrific panel. Thank you.